Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We'd like to welcome the audience back to our bi-monthly program, The Inner Voice. Today, the program is just a little different. We are the Inner Voice in Focus, and we're focusing on a subtopic that was brought up in the last episode, episode 4. You may have seen the poster that was out and circulating last week. We're talking about the AKHBARIs and the USULIs, a probe into history. And our featured speaker, as you all know him, he's been here twice on the program before, Zuhair Ladak. If you do have any questions, please make sure that you WhatsApp to 254-702-100-130. And just to give you a highlight, Zuhair Ladak will be speaking for about 30 minutes before we will be open to any questions. Zuhair, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, good. Yourself?
Alhamdulillah, thanks.
So Zuhair, the floor is now open for you. The topic, as we've all seen, AKHBARIs and USULIs. Bismillah, and please go ahead.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. All praise and glorification is due to Allah, the most sublime, and all salutations be upon Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his holy progeny. The schism between AKHBARI and USULI is one that is of utmost importance historically for the Shia Muslims, and in a contemporary setting affects many of our lives. It is one that leads us to appreciate the struggles that our scholars have gone through and how such events have shaped Shia jurisprudence from the earliest days to the modern age. The roots of this schism are found about 400 years ago when it first arose, and eventually it was closed down by the intellectual defeat of the AKHBARIs. However, while the fire was mostly put out, it left some smoldering pieces underneath the ashes. In the current times, this divide has received a new lease of almost a zombie-like life, especially in the last 3 decades. This being part of a two-pronged conspiracy attack on the Shia Ja'fariya madhab by the powers that be, with the main objective being the control of the Middle East. The first attack being on Azadari, and the second one on our Maraja, who standing in the Middle East has actually thwarted efforts by world powers for dominance. It is therefore increasingly important to understand this schism so as to realize the voices that are rising today, to know where this bandwagon left from historically, who are the ones who contrived it, and who are those who have now sought to revive it, and those who are currently jumping on this bandwagon of AKHBARIya. Inquiries such as, do we need our Maraj? Such as, what is the use of taqlid for those in the West? Are our Maraje in touch with the situation in the continents? And if the pioneering scholars of the past goofed in their methods, which are some of the most belligerent questions arising, and truly speaking, it's pure insolence. We shall do this in the following stages. 1, we will look at the history of the AKHBARI and USULI split. We will put this history into the context of the bigger picture of Islamic history, of course, so that you can join the dots from when things sound a little bit familiar to the point where now things start happening which are not within probably our knowledge. Secondly, we will look at the differences between the two schools and the implications, thirdly, in the current age and what we need to be aware of in this conspiracy. This will be of utmost importance. At the outset, it is necessary for us to understand and appreciate that these are not two divisions. AKHBARIs and USULIs are not two divisions, but simply two schools of thoughts, or you put it as pathways, if you may, on arriving at particular fatwas used by our scholars. There are no two divisions in Shia Jafariya sect. No way. Never was in the first place, and there probably, as long as we remain connected to our Maraje, there never will. Someone may turn around and ask, so who are the AKHBARIs and who are the USULIs? The AKHBARIs are those group of scholars, currently probably in the most minority, who believe that the hadith of the Masumeen are the main source of law. Akhbar coming from the word khabar, which of course means narrative, khabar. The AKHBARI scholars believed that the Quran and more importantly the hadith are the two sources of law, and no scholar is required to use ijma, which is consensus, or his intellect in deriving fatwa. Why? They maintain that these are the only two sources that the Prophet left us with in accordance with the hadith of Thaqalain. On the other hand, the Usuli scholars are those that believe that there are four sources of law. That is the Quran, the hadith, ijma, and aql. Aql meaning, of course, reasoning. These four sources, according to the Usuli scholars, can be used in any combination through the F itself when arriving at any fatwa, especially in the changing world. This is what is known as ijtihad per se, and the deduction of fatwas using these sources is known as istinbat. Historically, it needs to be put into context of the greater picture of Islamic history. The Prophet departed from this world in 11 AH, handing us over to the institution of Wilayah. This is where our major query against those who are anti-marjayyat arises. We raise the query against those who support Saqifa, while we are ready to believe that His Excellency Baqiyatullah left us to no one while going into life. This is probably the height of inanity. We cannot be further from the truth that when the Prophet left us, which was of course for 200 to 250 years until the birth of the 12th Imam, he could not leave us for that period, 250 years, without giving us an institution that will watch over us. Can the 12th Imam probably go into occultation and leave us for 1,250 years without any particular system in place? That would defeat logic, would it not? Wasailu Shia, a very important book, and I will tell you why it is important as we go along, compiled by Sheikh Hurre Amili, clearly, explicitly indicates that Hujjatullah Ajalullahu Farajahu Sharif instructed that when we are faced with any matter that arises from our new environments, we should refer to the scholars, for they are Hujjat over us, and Baqiyatullah is Hujjatullah over them. This hadith is recorded in all the major books, including Al-Ihtijaj of Sheikh Tabarsi as well. The 11th Imam clarified the criteria of the taqleed of for such fuqaha. Who are such fuqaha? He said categorically, muhafidan lidin, mukhalifan li hawa, muti'in li amri mawla. This is the criteria that the 11th Imam had explicitly cleared for us with regards to which fuqaha to follow. This is also recorded in Al-Ihtijaj by Sheikh Tabarsi, volume 2, page 485. So generally, we have been prepped for the major occultation by our A'imah. I believe they foresaw everything, and they knew what we were going into when it comes to the great occultation. By the time of the occultation, there were two major cadres of scholars. There is one we refer to as the Muhaddithin, who are the narrators and the ones who actually compile and record the narrations of the Masumeen. And then there is the other cadre, the Fuqaha, the jurists. Sheikh Kulaini, the writer of Al-Kafi, with 16,199 hadith, was an icon in narrators during this time. And it is due to his ijtihad that led to the authorship of Al-Kafi. He applied ilmul rijal to the selection of hadith and also ilmul kalam. Sheikh Kulaini passes away 329 in age, leaving us al-Kafi. During the same time, there were renowned Shia fuqaha, by the way. For example, Ibn Junayd al-Iskafi is one of the renowned fuqaha of the time. Another one is Ibn Ali Aqil al-Amman, who used reasoning to draw rulings from the Quran and Hadith. I will put these names into context. Following this, Sheikh al-Saduq comes up, another icon of Shia faith, and who wrote his exegesis, Man la yahdarul faqih, or rather, Kitab Man la yahdarul faqih. Bear these books in mind as we will refer to them later. This title, Kitab Man la yahdarul faqih, literally translates to a book where there is no fuqaha. This by extension means that where there is a fuqaha, the faqih should be emulated. It follows from common sense. The next ulama probably who played a major role is Sheikh al-Mufid, who is another bastion of Shia thought. Sheikh al-Mufid was tutored by Sheikh Saduq, and of course Ibn Junayd al-Iskafi, and he was also tutored by Ibn Ali Aqil al-Amani. These were his three teachers. He was inspired by one of his teachers, that is al-Amani, in terms of jurisprudence and the new circumstances that arose during the time of Sheikh al-Mufid. What he did was basically to combine these two disciplines into one scholarship and drew a middle line such that he was the first one to use ijtihad and istinbat deduction, to come up with rulings. His books, Al-Muqniya, Al-Tazkira fil Usul, and Amali Sheikh Mufid were testament to these efforts. Sheikh al-Mufid had an era that defined Shia jurisprudence from then on. His students, Sharif al-Murtada, brother to Sharif al-Radi, the compiler of Natural Balagha, and Sheikh al-Tusi in the middle of the 5th century of Hijrah continued in the same vein. They adopted intellectual reasoning in drawing rulings from Ahadith and the Quran. In his book Al-Dariyat, Sharif Murtaza mentions that he has found nothing in the Quran and Hadith that would prohibit taqlid and ijtihad. In another commentary, Kitabul Uddat by Sheikh Tusi, he writes that he has studied all the narrations namely Tahdhib al-Ahkam, which was actually a commentary of Al-Muqniya of Sheikh al-Mufid. And the other is Al-Istibsar. In the 7th century, Sheikh Ibn Taus, the author of Al-Luhuf, was the first to categorize hadith into 4 categories that we know today: Sahih, Hasan, Muwaththaq, and Za'if. There are differences in these categories. I do not want to go into the juristic aspect of it, but of course, these are the 4 categories of hadith that is applicable even today, which was of course founded by Sheikh Ibn Taus. Following this, Allama Hilli, another crucial error comes to pass, and he put forth the classification of Shia into Mujtahid and Muqallid. This was an important step in the process of ijtihad. It is Allama Hilli who set the stage for who to refer to who. The next scholar chronologically who would come into mind is Muhaqqiq al-Karki. Muhaqqiq al-Karki, a lesser known name amongst the Maraji, but nonetheless an icon in his own right. He was a renowned marja of his time, and he enjoyed the support of the Safavid state at the time. The Safavid state ended up making the Shia faith as the faith of the empire in the middle of the 10th century. This scholar introduced the use of ijtihad in legal and state affairs, setting the tone for an Islamic Shia state. By this time, mind you, the order of the day was the following of the four sources of law, that is Quran, Hadith, Ijma, and Aql, from the time of the occultation. And all of these four laws or four sources were put together to bring out rulings. Then rises someone known as Muhammad Amin Astrabadi. Mind that name. Amin Astrabadi, according to Western writers, was, for example, in this instance, Rula Abisab and Muhammad al-Sayyad, who write in some of the journals entries, which were recorded in the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. Amin Astrabadi hailed from Shiraz, Iran, in the later part of the 10th century. And from then on, he migrated to Mecca and studied under his last tutor, who was known as Mirza Muhammad Astrabadi. Amin Astrabadi at that point develops some antagonism towards the scholars' methods of ijtihad, despite having been tutored by ijtihadi scholars. He initially held contempt for the Sunni Mutazila school of extreme intellectualism. The Sunni Mutazila school puts intellectualism or reason above hadith and probably the Quran as well. The contempt rose from there, but no sooner had probably the contempt bred some sort of roots inside Muhammad Amin Astrabadi, he turns rogue. And probably this is not the first instance where one of our own turns rogue in history. He became critical of ijtihad and taqlid, and was especially of disregard to Muhaqqiq al-Karki's methods. He advocated that one should use only Quran and Hadith as sources of law, and no form of ijma or reasoning is to be applied in reducing rulings. He also engaged in insult and abuse of scholars, and he was supported by some of the proponents of AKHBARI teachings as well, under his own guidance. This had the markings of Ahl Hadith of the Sunnis. There are some Western writers who refer to the AKHBARIs as probably being the Salafists of the Shia. It is evident, according to Rula Abisab, that it was probably Amin's origin being a Persian that caused some dissent and some controversy against the Arab scholars. If you would have watched the series of Mukhtar, you will find that particular aspect coming in as well. It was there, and probably it existed, of course, at the time of Muhammad Amin Astrabadi. There was a bit of friction between the Persians and the Arabs. And this probably was another example of it when it comes to the antagonism between the Persians and the Arabs. He wrote a book, Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah, and set the stage for the first AKHBARI cognizance in Shia academia. This is the first time that the dichotomy of AKHBARI and USULI as names are seen to appear in use in the academic circles in reference to scholars who choose either path to reaching fatwa. This was the first time anyone was ever called an AKHBARI or anyone was ever referred to as an USULI. Amin Astrabadi was pretty vocal. He had aggressive means to waylay or to lay out his points, and often violent AKHBARI tendencies, of course, were also seen. This is, of course, recorded in Western scholars' histories. However, the Persian support at that time was considerable, especially from Shiraz and Isfahan as well. And the support grew as these Persians who supported the view of AKHBARI, or rather of Astrabadi, when they migrated to Arab lands. So the thought grew during this time. Quite a few renowned scholars joined the ranks in terms of being Akhbari or using the Akhbari method as well. Albeit these scholars never opposed Ijtihadi scholars' methods, apart from, of course, Muhammad Amin al-Sabadi himself. Such renowned scholars who used the Akhbari approach, that is, of course, of using Quran and Hadith only, are probably Muhammad Taqi Majlisi the first, the father of Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, the author of Bihar, who the latter was actually a prominent Usuli scholar. Another name is Allama Muhsin Faid Kashani, and of course the most famous Sahib Wasail Shia, Sheikh Qurre Amini, was probably also of the Akhbari lane. Though they were considered as moderate Akhbaris, and of course they had their method, they did not oppose the other school in terms of applying their own methods. By the middle of the 12th century, the Akhbari school enjoyed quite a bit of prominence in Karbala. As I said, there was a migration from, of course, from the Persian state to the Arab lands, and this was the period of the zenith of this school of thought. Zachary Hearn, in his 2011 PhD, if I'm not mistaken, when he's presenting his dissertation, he notes that the Akhbari by then were using hard-handed tactics, such as arming violent groups to put down Usuli thought, and the element of takfir was also surprisingly applied, referring to the writings by Usuli scholars as najis, and that praying behind them was forbidden. Amin Astrabadi passes away 1033, leaving behind his Akhbari legacy. But such hard-handed tactics are seen in various schools even today. And they come up and say, it's either our way or the free way to hell. That is their modus operandi. According to Hearn, the Akhbari approach was never going to last. In his thesis, he says that it seemed to be a straitjacket, an ossified method that would not budge with changing circumstances. The method would not change. It is at this point that Ayatollah Wahid Bahbahani, a prominent Usuli scholar, enters the fray in Karbala in a landmark point that would shift the tide in Shia academia. By this time, the leader of the Akhbari school in Karbala was Sheikh Yusuf Bahrani, who is known to be the author of Kitab al-Hadaiq. Ayatollah Barbahani, by then, due to, of course, the pressures that were applied on Usuli scholars in Karbala, used to hold his classes in silence and probably in secrecy. His first students were his own nephews, cousins, who joined, of course, his classes. When Sheikh Bahbahani, or Ayatollah Bahbahani rather, established a firm foothold, he challenged Bahrani to public debates. Bahrani, mind you, was a moderate, unlike his predecessor, Amin Astrabadi. His defeat at debates led him to asking Ayatollah Bahbahani to attend his classes in Bahrani's absence in Karbala. It was here that Bahbahani converted 2/3 of the students of Bahrani. 2/3 who were being tutored, of course, the Akhbari way, now immediately within the effect of that circumstance that was present at that point, converted to the Usuli way. Some of the most surprising names that probably were initially tutored as Akhbari and probably then went into Usuli are Ayatollah Mahdi Bahrul Qulub and Ayatollah Jafar Kashif al-Gitar. At the same time, there was an Afghan invasion into the Arab lands. This was in 1722 Christian era. And this saw Bahrani tone down his rhetoric, the Afghan invasion was, of course, a Sunni invasion. And it was at this point that Bahrani decided to tone down his rhetoric and cool down a bit so that he could have a united Shia front to face the Sunni invasion. In his own book, Bahrani writes, that is, of course, Kitab al-Hadayat, that he is not an Akhbari, neither is he an Usuli. But he is somewhere in between. He criticized the insult of scholars and the methods applied by his predecessors. By then, there was mutual respect between the Usuli and the Akhbari scholars. And Bahrani passes away, and very surprisingly, in his will and testament, he asked for his funeral prayers to be recited by Ayatollah Bahbahani. This was the final nail in the coffin of Akhbari school, and from this time on, Usuli scholars were again on the precedent as they have been for the last 500 to 700 years. This material, of course, is all available for reference. The Akhbari dominance in Karbala lasted for about 100 years, give or take 100 to 150 years, until Ayatollah Bahbahani shifted the tides. He is renowned as a mujaddid, a reviver of Usuli school in Karbala. Ayatollah Bahbahani passes away 1209 AH, and he is succeeded by Ayatollah Mahdi Bahrul Ulum, and thereafter by Ayatollah Jafar Kashif al-Ghida. His legacy would live on after him. It is in the middle of the 13th century Hijrah, and another stalwart of Shia faith rises up, Ayatollah Murtaza Ansari. Ayatollah Murtaza Ansari revolutionized Marjaiyat and introduced the centralization of Marjaiyat into a universal law. This was, of course, the Usuli approach. He was the most learned of the time, and it was due to his efforts that all Shia in the world at that time would refer to the most alim, the most learned of the time in respect of their queries. Initially, of course, they would refer to the locally available scholar in terms of his rulings on a particular issue. But with Ayatollah Murtaza Ansari's efforts, Marjaiyat was made universal. He was probably the first global marja that we know in terms of history. At that time, the center of his school, of his establishment was in Najaf. And it was at that point that all homes would now go to one place from throughout the Shia world. This is what our scholars are. This is what our scholars are. As a testament to his honesty and his integrity, Ayatollah Ansari passed away without leaving anything for his heirs. He had no funds for his own funeral. His funeral was donated towards by a well-wisher. This is what our scholars go through. He is one out of many who probably have sacrificed their lives for the system we are enjoying today. The system of universal marjaiyat is a system we follow worldwide today, and 99% of the scholars who come out of houses all over the world are usul, and they rely on the four sources of law. It is near impossible these days to actually find an Akhbari scholar today who commands any following. And as such, there are no two factions. We, the Shia Ja'fariya, are one, attached to our Marajih, as per the instructions of our Imams and the Sunnah of the Prophet. It is clear, therefore, that this episode in Shia academia was completely scholarly and that there was no interference or the involvement of the laity to any great degree. It rose up about 400 years ago and ended about 250 years ago, not to be unheard of again until the zombie rose up in the last decade or so. We'll come to that. What are the differences between the two schools of thought? It was never taqlid to begin with. The difference was always on what source of law to use to derive fatwa. Taqlid was there. Would it be the AKHBARI method of Quran and Hadith only, where Hadith takes precedence? Or the USULI method of Quran, Hadith, Ijma, and Aql? The issue was technically how to reach a fatwa, either by the rule of two or the rule of four. The opposition to taqlid was possibly a reaction to the animosity towards the USULI rise in state affairs. The opposition was towards that. And probably there was some resentment from the founder of AKHBARI school. That, of course, was something personal. That is one difference. The other difference is that the AKHBARI considered the four Kutub Arba. Now, I have mentioned the Kutub Arba earlier as we go along. We mentioned that, of course, the first one is Al-Kafi. The second one is Sheikh Saduq's Man La Yahdurul Faqih. The third one is, yes, Tahdhib al-Ihkam by Sheikh Tusi. And the fourth one is by Sheikh Tusi as well, and Al-Istibsar. They considered that the Kutub Arba, which I have, of course, mentioned to you, as to be sahih in every manner. This will make sense as we go along shorter. While with the USULI, they did not accept that, while, of course, the compilers of the four books did their ijtihad to the best, and probably there were bastions of Shia faith and jurisprudence, but they still held that the collection always needed some sort of ijtihad and research, such as Ilmul Rijal, Ilmul Kalam, for its authentication. The other major difference between the two is that the AKHBARIs believed that, and they still do, that the Quran was revealed to the Ahlul Bayt as the final addressees. This is where probably we shoot ourselves in our foot. They say that it is the Holy Household who would clarify the verses of the Holy Quran, be they muhkam or mutashabih. Therefore, even if an ayat was muhkam, the AKHBARIs will look for the hadith to verify that particular ayat, and then they apply it in their lives. Now, you see where the hadith have taken precedence over the Quran. Therefore, now, technically, their main source of law was the hadith, which was of course beyond reproach. And of course, the four books had to be sahih, because now that they have relegated the Quran, of course, to the holy progeny, they were left with nothing else, of course, but the hadith now. The USULIs, on the other hand, did not have such methods and considered muhkam ayat to be clear enough to follow, with or without supporting hadith. We can also draw a bit of similarities here between the AKHBARI school and, of course, the Ahlul Sunnah when it comes to the SAFAR center. And the AKHBARI were blaming us, or the USULIs, for following the Mutalsilite school. To the AKHBARI, as another difference to the AKHBARI, if it wasn't the Quran, if something wasn't in the Quran, or it wasn't in the Hadith, and if there wasn't a clear prohibition of an act or its support, they would consider that act as haram on ihtiyat. If it does not appear in the Quran, if a particular act does not appear in the Hadith, there is no clear prohibition or there is no clear support, that act will be considered haram on ihtiyat, meaning things such as organ donation, insurance, stock market, IVF, vaccinations, cosmetic plastic surgeries. All these probably considered prohibited because they aren't contained in hadith. The Usuli approach was simple, and you probably have heard this, that everything is halal unless clearly prohibited through hadith and Quran while applying reasoning and consensus. Another difference was that reasoning or intellect was not to be used in drawing fatwas. And as such, the reliance be on clear hadith and Quran for the Akbar. For the Usuli, it is clear that in addition to Quran, hadith, ijma and aql were also sources of law, and that there was allowed and it would be effective in the changing situation of the world as time went on, and adapt to our circumstances. And you can see it, of course. There are some of the major differences. You will find many when you go along, but the whole system gravitates around one main difference: the rule of two or the rule of one. The rest of them, of course, are differences that come out from this major rift. Therefore, what is the implication? It is quite fascinating that this part of history has not been hidden from the powers that be in the world today. To assert dominance, they basically have sought to revive this faction amongst the laity, amongst the laymen, so as to weaken the following of the Maraja and thus dominate the Middle East. People are literally paid to speak against scholars and revive this long buried academic debate amongst the ignorant following. The abuse and insult of Maraja, the question on their relevance, the passing of judgments on scholars of the past, the current scholars the current scholars and how they have handled issues is probably common practice these days. Gatherings are held specifically to do this, either in private or in public. Who suffers? Our children. Our children are being taken away from the guidance of great ulama. When questions are put into their minds of the relevance of such ulama, it creates a doubt in the mind of our children. And then they start questioning the need of the taqleed, despite the fact that we have rich history of our ijtihad and how it has moved along from the time of the Prophet. You will notice that none of these pseudo-Akhbaris these days will face a renowned scholar or probably or debate a learned person. They would use street corners and probably crowded bazaars to speak to the laity and unsuspecting passers-by, because of course they would use terminologies that probably would probably leave the laity flabbergasted and probably buy into the theme. It is basically for us to understand what is happening and know about our history and what our great Maraja has done in bringing the faith to us. Then from there further to take it upon ourselves through, to take it upon themselves, rather, through ijtihad and taqleed, to have our deeds accepted by the Almighty Allah in Qiyam. A very good example is the Tawzih al-Masail of Agha Sistani, where you will read at the opening chapters where he says that if you follow the Tawzih, then the responsibility of your deeds are on you. Many of these scholars have attained levels probably we would merely dream of, if we do have the capacity of imagination of those levels in the first place. The AKHBARI and USULI schism was always an intellectual debate for the scholars of the past and was never deemed to be divisive or disuniting the Shia Ja'fari faith. Taqleed was never the issue originally. The question was how to arrive at fact. This was the the major question. And it was ended. The schism came and went, as came and went the notion that the earth was flat. But the problem with our madhab, the mazlumiyat of our madhab is that when we go and repair our shoe, we would look for a shoe repairer. But then when it comes to issues of religion, even the fruit vendor outside has an opinion to give. This is the saddest part of us being Shia. Our practices that we are putting into place have reached us today through the ijtihad of this Maharaj, and a series of fatwas that have been passed down and preserved over time. We would never have known how to pray or even do wudu if it wasn't for our scholars. The principles of religious practice we take for granted today have come to us courtesy of those who gave their lives researching, perfecting, and telling us what could be God's command on areas probably that we would be at sea. The least we could do is emulate these scholars or be one ourselves. Either way, ijtihad is part of our faith, and it is necessary for its preservation until the re-emergence of Al-Hujjat of Sharif. Before I end, to pseudo-Akhbaris out there who are seeking to divide the Shia Jafri faith, and probably that is their own view, I say the following. Taqlid means emulating a scholar. You emulate what you see. You emulate what you see. You do not emulate or do taqlid of an imam. You simply obey the imam. Everyone is performing taqlid one way or another, including those who say they don't. The difference is the usulis emulate the scholars in obedience to the imam. Akhbaris, who are you emulating? Thank you, Nazir.
Thank you for the enlightening topic on Akhbaris and Usulis. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. I'll go through it, give you a minute to catch your breath. The first question that's come through is the Akhbaris are defined, of course, as Muslims who reject the use of reasoning in deriving verdicts, and they believe in the Quran and the Hadith. But the Quran invites man to think, to reason, to ponder. Doesn't this nullify their school of thought outright? Zuhair, are we on the same page? Okay. Fine. Let me repeat the question. Akhbaris are defined as Muslims who reject the use of reasoning in deriving verdicts, and they believe in the Quran and Hadith. Okay, are we okay so far? Okay. But the Quran invites man to think and reason and ponder. Doesn't this nullify their school of thought outright?
Is that the question, Nazir? Is that the question?
Yes. Doesn't this nullify their school of thought outright? Yeah.
As I had said, amongst the differences between the two schools of thought, the Akhbaris would not accept a muhkam ayat if there was no hadith supporting that muhkam ayat. So if that verse invited them to think, they will go and look for a hadith that invited them to think, and then they would. Are we together?
Yes, we are, but yeah, so far.
Open. This is open for reference. Of course, I'm going to quite a few people. Of course, I do not know where I'm being seen at and which part of the globe. But having said that, this is open for them to research. And of course, I would invite them to have a look at this. It is good. But this is the outright fact as far as difference between the two schools are concerned. The hadith has to be there. That is the akhbari fact.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Brother Zuhair, well spoken. However, where would you categorize the following? Number one, the Malangs. And number two,
The what?
Malangs.
Yes.
And number two, the scholar Surush.
Okay. Okay. The Malangs seem to have a leaning towards the Sufi line of thought. Their attachment is probably to Bayt and most probably to Imam Ali. Similar to, of course, some of the Sufis. They do not apply any reasoning to their deductions. They simply try and connect to the greater truth using metaphysical. So as far as the Malangs are concerned, that probably could be a very minor, of course, a very simple definition of their lines of belief. They have a leaning towards the Sufi. When it comes to, of course, Abdul Karim Surush, you must have heard this name flouted around a few years ago, probably amongst the Khoja circles, where we were asked to read and to know more about a scholar as blessed as Abdul Karim Surush. Abdul Karim Surush, in very clear terms, without wasting a lot of time, does not believe in the presence of a living Imam, the 12th Imam. He does not believe that there is Al-Qaim present physically in this world. And we were asked to, of course, have a look at this, and he was a brilliant man. That's what we have been told. We are being told. Now, this is where the biggest fallacy comes in, when we are being guided to such scholars. That's what happens when we decide to detach from the Murad, isn't it? That's what happens. We will be driven here. We will be driven to another, probably, who raises an objection to Ziyarat Ashura and probably the Arba'in as well. So, yeah, that's all there for you to see. Nazir, thanks.
Okay, so we have a question here. Apparently somebody might have missed this particular, the question is, where exactly is the exact difference between Tawhidis and us, the Shia Ja'fari school of thought?
As far as the Tawhidis are concerned, there are, of course, the major difference between these two schools is the practical belief as far as godness is concerned without going through the imams. That is where one of the most fundamental beliefs, of course, comes into play. When somebody, of course, refers directly to Allah without going through the channels that probably they've been put into place, as far as that particular belief is concerned, in a very minor nutshell. And of course, the Shia Ja'fariya school, we believe in wasila, and of course, we believe in the channels that have been put down to us by Allah Himself. That is the Ahlul Bayt. Of course, we would go through God through that particular aspect, and that is the way probably they would look at it. Thanks for being.
Okay, it seems like those are the questions we had for tonight. And a couple of comments that came up were that you were very well, you were elaborate in your explanation. One person even said they can't even think of any questions because of how clear you are in describing this topic. So That's kudos to you, Zuhair. Here at we want to thank you at the Inner Voice for being a part of our program, and we hope that have you on board with us in the near future, inshallah.
Thank you, Nazir. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Okay, so the audience, we want to thank everyone for. I'm sorry. Wait, hold on, Zuhair. If you don't mind, there's a question that just came through. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, mashallah, Zuhair, thank you for the enlightening probe into history. As a community, we have very limited knowledge of our history and our roots as Shias. That is why our opponents have an upper hand over us. From today's talk, we are nowhere near to knowing our Shia faith. Should we not spend more time into learning our history and grassroots rather than spending time into materialism and politics?
You would not have spoken in a more elaborate way yourself, whoever has asked that question. That is a brilliant comment. Yes, we should spend a lot more time in thinking and trusting. What I'm going to say is that I myself, of course, before this particular talk, when I was doing research, on this particular topic, I personally learned quite a bit about our history, and I've come to appreciate our line of jurisprudence, our faith, and the way it has developed over time, and the sacrifices that our scholars have given. Yes, of course, by underscoring that, we should look at our history and, of course, teach it to our children as well, encourage them to read as well. It is important that they also have track of what is going on, and avoid the traps and the waylaying tactics that have been put into place to weigh on history.
Alhamdulillah, I think we also touched on this last time, that we can't throw everything on the madrasa or school. There must be some form of actions done at home as well for our youth.
Indeed.
Which brings me to inform our audience that in 2 weeks, inshallah, the next topic will be Islamic parenting in the 21st century, and we look forward to having you all with us. Zuhair, once again, thank you, and Khuda Hafiz for tonight.
Thank you, Nazir.